This is just, I intend this to be an informal presentation. I have a number of ideas. It may come across as a little bit disjointed as a consequence because I'm thinking of different ideas as I'm going through this. So please excuse that sort of informality. Let me say at the outset, before I even get into that, I want to express my appreciation for what you're doing with this conference. Given the difficulties that all of you have faced over this last year or more, both as a country and then internally as an organization, it's pretty amazing that you're able to think ahead and still come together and still see it's important to carry on the work of the Academy. So I want to congratulate you for going forward with this and not being, shrinking away and being frightened of not moving forward with the work. Anyway, that said, many years ago when I was a student, I remember taking courses in sociology and another course in cultural anthropology. And my recollection of the cultural anthropology course was we spent a lot of time focusing on artifacts. And I found it quite boring as a young college student to spend all this time with artifacts. Since that time, as my life and my career and so on have evolved, I've come to appreciate the fact that culture is much bigger and broader than just artifacts. And in fact, it is so big and so broad that it encompasses the entire social environment, if you will, in which we live. And what I'm pointing out is that the social environment as distinct from the physical environment, which is pretty much a given. I mean, we can alter to some degree the physical environment, but not to a great degree. But the social environment is man-made. We create this environment. We create our languages. We create how we dress. We create what we eat. We create the music that we appreciate. We create our beliefs in God or not in God or whoever we believe in. All of those things are man-made. And as a consequence of being man-made, they suffer to some degree in the same failings, if you will, of everything else that's man-made. It's not perfect. And therefore it's subject to problems along the way. So what are these elements? Well, some of this has already been presented. What are the elements of this culture that ultimately lead to a culture code? We got art, we have music, we have dress, we have language, we have foods, we also have religion, and we have behavior. Now, there's not a lot of issue about art and music and dress and language and food. But when we get to religion and behavior, this is where some of the difficulties can arise. We then, as different communities and different groupings tend to form their particular cultures and their unique aspects of what they want to focus on and so on, we see created an us versus them idea, with us being our particular group that shares our particular culture code. And then there are all those other people outside who are them. Now, there's not that, at the outset, there's nothing particularly wrong with that idea, and it's understandable how that occurs. Where the difficulty arises is when us begin to think that we are better than them. Right? So it's not only that we're different, we're better. We're superior in some fashion, that our beliefs, our behaviors are superior to those of these other groups. And then we may conclude from that, we need to encourage them, and maybe encourage is not even the proper word, to adopt our ways of what we believe and what we do. And we are going to do that either voluntarily on their part, or we're going to force them into doing that. And there's a lot of history throughout human history of those kinds of things that have resulted in that. So this notion of culture and the culture code, which governs how people relate to each other, works pretty well within the particular group. It's when the group sees the outside group, the other group, and then begins to make judgments about them that the difficulties occur. We call that tribalism. people then to pull back. And they pull in, if you will, and they group around each other and they preserve each other. And then there are all these other outgroups and so on. Now, at a time when, let's say, many, many years ago, when we didn't have international travel and international communication and so on, that wasn't so much of a problem. It existed at that time, but it wasn't so much of a problem. Now, today, we have the ability to communicate, just as witness what we're doing right now. We have this ability to communicate instantaneously on a global scale. We can travel on a global scale and so on. And people can move on a global scale from one place to another. And where the issue arises is they move from one cultural background with that cultural code to another one with another different cultural background and a different cultural code. And we see what's happening, the United States being a good example of that, with immigration is an example of that. We have enormous issues going on in this country surrounding the problem of immigration. We're deporting people, including deporting people to countries that they didn't originally come from. We are deporting people who are actually American citizens back to some other countries because we are pulling in. When I say we, I mean the big we. I don't mean all of us individually. The big we, we're pulling in, and it's us, and we don't want them. We don't want them. We want them to go back where they came from, and we're going to have our country, and we're going to take care of all of that. And it's not unique to the United States. I think Europe is having the same sorts of issues. The immigration that's coming from Africa, for example, in the Middle East, and their people in European countries now who feel like they're being overwhelmed with people coming from other countries. Again, they bring their own culture code. They bring their languages, their foods, their traditions, and their behavior patterns, and so on. And they clash with the indigenous culture code. And then that continues to cause problems. And we see this tribalism issue. So you have different ethnic groups in competition with each other, different religious groups in competition with each other, different political ideologies that are in contrast with other things. And because of the flow of people back across national borders, this has become an enormous global sorts of issue. Again, the notion of a cultural code is governing how people relate to each other. It's the idea, again, that we share something in common. Now, given my background is as a criminologist, so among all of these characteristics of a culture, the thing I am most interested in is behavior, and in particular, deviant behavior. What behavior within a culture becomes defined as being deviant? Okay, and that differs, as we know, from one culture to another. As soon as when you begin to think about behavior, and then you think about deviant behavior, that means you have to have some kind of regulation. Okay, what are the criteria for determining that some behavior is deviant? So now you have regulation. Regulation means rules. As soon as you have rules, the expectation is, given that we're all human beings and we're not perfect, they're going to be people who violate the rules. Now what happens to those people who violate the rules? Now you got to have sanctions. Okay. Otherwise, if you just have rules, you have no sanctions, then the rules are not going to mean anything. So you have rules, so you got to have sanctions. You got to have an enforcement mechanism. Okay. Who determines that the rules have been violated, and who assesses that the person should suffer the sanction, and what should the sanction be? These then tend to differ from one culture to another. I spent some time in Saudi Arabia, for example. And one of the things, I don't know whether I was not aware of this before, was how the women's social roles in Saudi Arabia, very, very different than in the United States, right? And I saw a religious police who were enforcing dress codes on Saudi women, and I was totally unfamiliar with that notion. Doesn't exist in the United States as such, but it's a regulation. It's a rule. There's a sanction for the rule, and there's an enforcement mechanism for that rule. Okay, and then ultimately rules in some cases become laws. Now you have the problem or the issue of the rule of law. Okay, what are the laws going to be? How are we going to abide by the rule of law? Again, they're going to be violations because we are who we are. We will violate the law. Okay, they're going to be sanctions for violating the law, some mechanism for applying those sanctions. And around all of this, we want the concept of justice. We want justice and we want fairness. We want the application of those rules to be fair across the board to everyone. And we want to, if we do something wrong, we are more inclined to accept the sanction that's given to us if we see the process as being fair, that we were treated fairly. We had our opportunity to make our case and it was heard, and we have violated the rule. We want to live in this society. We recognize that this society has to operate in accordance with the rule of law. Therefore, we will suffer the penalty that we deserve because we did something wrong. So that, but this is, and this kind of thing goes all the way from the very local level, parents raising their children, for example, when parents discipline their children. What are they disciplining them for? Does the child understand that they've done something wrong? Do they see the discipline as being fair? Or are more than one child in the same family treated the same way? Or are some children allowed behaviors that other children are not? Then you got an issue of fairness. And children very early on understand when they're not being treated fairly. And then it just goes through, the teenage years, adolescence, and into adult. We want to be treated fairly. We don't want any sort of like more harsh penalty for what we're doing when somebody else got away with the same thing. So it goes from the very local level, family, all the way up to countrywide societies that are dealing with those sorts of issues. One of the things very early in my career, I worked with juvenile delinquent boys in a correctional institution. And a lot of these boys grew up with what was called a street culture. They spent a lot of their time out on the street belonging to juvenile gangs, and they had their own culture. And it was a very macho-oriented kind of culture. They had to be tough. They couldn't back down from aggressive behaviors. They had to exert themselves and be tough. Otherwise, they would be seen as what we call sissies. And that's the last thing that they wanted to be. So they had their own culture. And what that suggests to me is that this notion of culture and cultural codes exists at many, many, many different levels. And it's got so many complex aspects to it, which I think by and large reflect the complexity of human beings. What a complex bunch of creatures we are in terms of all of the things, what we believe and what we want and what we need and how we relate to each other and all of those things. We have created these systems to do that. One last anecdote I'll tell you, and then I'll stop. I spent a lot of time traveling in Russia. One time I was in Moscow. This is back in the 1980s. And there were some Americans who were visiting. There weren't too many Americans visited Soviet Union in those years, but there were some Americans visiting. And we had gone to the ballet, in the Kirov Ballet in St. Petersburg. And we were needing a ride back to our hotel. So we went back to the bus. And all the other Americans were already on the bus. They didn't know who we were because we were not part of that group. And they were talking to each other. And what they were doing was complaining. They complained about the food. They complained about their hotel rooms. They complained everything. And the thought that occurred to me was, this is why people think about the ugly Americans. Because Americans go to other places and they judge other cultures and other societies by American standards. And it's back to this we're better than them idea. Right? It's us and them, and by the way, us, we're better. Right? This is the idea. This is where the ugly American syndrome fits in. And then we wonder why people resent that Americans have that sort of us and them attitude and superiority attitude, if you will. But it's a culturally related thing. It's a culture code. And I don't mean by this, by the way, that every single American is like that. We're not. Right? But we know that there are some who are, and that those are issues. And I think they're examples of what cultural codes are and how they can come into conflict. Thank you.